Our goal here is to bring the fighting to a close. This is where we take a look at how England tried shifting its strategy to the south. I mean, clearly you can see the southern strategy, but also how the fighting is going to come to an end with Yorktown. Now, late 1770s, in the early 1780s, the British are going to turn their attention to the colonial South, and they believed that they would have much more support amongst the local populace. This is kind of a result of the fact that you have Trenton and Princeton, you have Saratoga, and many of these northern places. The British were unsuccessful. Now, as they shifted to the south, they did capture important port cities like Charlestown and Savannah, but every time they tried to move north to link up with the northern portion of the British Army that was in New York, because remember, they still control New York City. It's just the rest they're having a hard time with. So when Lord Cornwallis, leader of the southern British forces, every time he tries to go north, doesn't work out. The militia will harass them every step of the way and continually cut their supply lines. This means that Cornwallis and the British are kept completely in the south. Now, Washington's men are very nervous about straying south to directly engage Cornwallis because the heat is intense and there's the threat of disease. Ever since New York City was taken by the British, Washington has pinned his hopes on a great, glorious battle that would defeat the British and win back New York. The issue is that in mid August, so we're talking 1781, in mid August, Lafayette told Washington that Cornwallis had joined forces with Benedict Arnold and tried to conquer Virginia. So by this time, Benedict Arnold has gone to the British side, and Lafayette, to a degree, is in charge of Americans in the South. So Arnold and Cornwallis try to conquer Virginia, but they end up kind of holed up in Yorktown to protect supplies and get expected reinforcements by the sea. Now, Yorktown, we can see it right here. It's on the eastern tip of the Virginia Peninsula. We've got the Chesapeake Bay, and it's divided by the James River as well as the York River. There was a French fleet led by Admiral de Grasse. You can see him here. They were coming from the Caribbean. They were heading north from the Caribbean with 29 ships and 3,200 men after defeating a British force in the Caribbean. So Washington and the French commander, Rochambeau, they joined forces to cut off Cornwallis by land. So you can see the Americans cut him off here by land. The window is small. The window is incredibly small for victory because Admiral de Grasse needed to sail back to the Caribbean by mid-October. So Washington abandons his hopes of a glorious victory in New York. Now, what we have are 9,000 British troops squaring off against 19,000 American and French forces. Nearly double the numbers. This turns into a siege. It's a classic European siege warfare. The French understood how to conduct siege warfare, the Americans, not so much. Now, near the end of the siege, two separate forces were going to have to storm two defensive British positions. One was led by the French, and that was vicious fighting, massive casualties. The other was led by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton finally gets his command. It happens in the dead of night. You see, up until this point, Hamilton had been an aide de camp of Washington. He's more like a secretary. Washington considers him so important that he won't let him actually fight, but Hamilton keeps begging and begging. This is his chance. So in the dead of night, he calls for a bayonet charge so that it's completely silent. This lasts about 10 minutes. The French one took much longer. It was vicious, many casualties. Hamilton's charge lasted 10 minutes. It had minimal casualties, and it actually featured the heroics of the mainly black Rhode Island 1st Regiment. So this connects back to the beginning of the fighting, where we saw that the Continental Army was fully integrated. Black and white soldiers fighting side by side. This doesn't happen again until Vietnam. Here, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, mainly black soldiers, helps win the day. Now, Hamilton, to his end, he takes those 10 minutes and he rides that the rest of his life. He's the hero of Yorktown. That's his reputation, and that helps his political career. Now, we have the American and French forces on land. This is a depiction of Hamilton's unit charging what was called Redoubt 10. The French fleet cut off Cornwallis and bombarded him by water, and the land artillery was nonstop. So October 17th, 1781, Lord Cornwallis orders the surrender. This is the common depiction of that surrender, known as the world turned upside down. So 2 days later, October 19th, French and American soldiers lined a road that was half a mile long. And British and Hessian soldiers had to walk in between them, called walking the gauntlet. They had to surrender their weapons at the end of this gauntlet, and many tried to smash them. And then they had to double back. They had to walk in between these soldiers to get rid of their weapons and walk back between them empty-handed. There was one British soldier that noted the clear contrast between the very well-dressed French troops in their white uniforms and the ragged, often barefoot American soldiers. There were many British soldiers that refused to make eye contact with the Americans. They were so disgusted that they lost, until the song Yankee Doodle was played. Now, with the surrender, it's very interesting and it gets kind of petty. Lord Cornwallis refused to personally surrender to Washington, so he sent his subordinate officer, General O'Hara, to surrender. O'Hara presents the sword of Lord Cornwallis to Commander Rochambeau, who's French. Rochambeau refuses to accept the sword because symbolically they're trying to say, hey, we the British, we're surrendering to the French. Rochambeau said nope. He motions towards Washington. Washington refused to accept the sword via a subordinate. He would only accept it from Cornwallis himself. So he directed his subordinate, Major General Lincoln, to accept it. So the subordinate of Lord Cornwallis gives the sword of Lord Cornwallis to the subordinate of Washington. If it sounds confusing and petty, it kind of is, but it's somewhat amusing that this is how it would all end. 8,000 British troops then simply left Yorktown. October 1781. The fighting has been going on for about 6 years. This is the last decisive victory. When news of Yorktown reaches Great Britain, Prime Minister Lord North proclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." King George III refused to accept the reality, and he wanted to throw more men at the situation. Now, interestingly enough, the Dutch did grant the U.S. diplomatic recognition the following spring, meaning they recognized them as a nation. England began to understand this was a war they could not win. They did begin to withdraw, but obviously it's going to take some time. Henry Clinton's army, the British commander, Henry Clinton, sailed from New York to relieve Cornwallis, but he received news of the defeat and just didn't want to engage the French fleet. So he went with his 6,000 men back to New York. So the British begin to understand, we're not going to win this thing. It's over. Washington didn't want to be too complacent, and this is something that's often lost when you look at the Revolution. Is Yorktown the last major battle? Yes. But he believed that Yorktown would cause the British to throw everything they had at the Americans, which that was George III's inclination. He wanted to really hammer down. There's still a sizable British presence in America. They're in New York. So he kept the army together for another whole year. Now, the men are tired of just drilling and no fighting. They're tired of drilling, but they're upset because they haven't been paid. They don't have food. I mean, if people don't get paid and they can't eat, they're going to be upset. So the soldiers did, to an extent, threaten Congress. Many believed Washington was going to become a dictator, and if he could have, he probably could have gotten away with it, but he diffused the situation. He addressed his officers and told them to back down. Prior to reading a letter that was written by a Virginia congressman, he put his glasses on. He put his spectacles on to read it. No officer had ever seen their general in glasses. His words were, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." His men started weeping that their commander would willingly admit this. And he did remain in command until word of the peace treaty reached America and the British finally left New York. So he officially resigned. He resigned December 1783 because it takes a while for the treaty to get negotiated. Could he have been a military dictator? Yes. History tells us that that's the route America was going. But from the start, Washington, a military general, submitted to Congress. He submits to civilian control of the military. The war is over. He resigns and goes home. It's the first of two times in American history in our early formative years when Washington has all the power. If he wanted to, he could have taken it. But all he wanted to do was return home to his beloved estate at Mount Vernon. So officially, 1775 to 1783, the fighting portion of the American Revolution has come to a close.